Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to 2017 Teacher Development with British Council event. Thank you so much for making time to be here on a Saturday morning. Before we start, can you please raise your hand if you were here yesterday evening? Jeremy, this is for you. Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming back. I hope that you're going to enjoy today's sessions. As you know, today we're going to have two sessions. This is going to be the first one. But before we start, I've got a technical announcement for you. When we're done with this session, during the second session, you're going to receive these packs, which include a questionnaire, feedback questionnaire, and a treasure hunt. And what I'm going to ask you is that if you provide us with your feedback, you can attend a draw on Sunday evening, and you're going to get some presents from the British Embassy Yerevan. And if you manage to answer to the treasure hunt questions, which are based on the sessions that you're attending, you're going to get Jeremy Harmer's book, the 5th edition. It's not only one, by the way. You're going to have 4 lucky winners. So please make sure that during lunch break, you go out and take these packs so that you can participate in this competition. Also, if you provide your feedback, which we very much appreciate, you're going to get some valuable presents from British Embassy Yerevan. That's it from technical side. But welcome back. As you know, as I said, we are going to have 2 sessions. I think very briefly, I'm going to introduce Jeremy Harmer for those of you who may be attending for the first time. Jeremy Harmer is an experienced teacher and trainer. He's a writer of methodology titles, learning literature, and course books. Among his titles are The Practice of English Language, which is actually this book, How to Teach English, and Essential Teacher Knowledge. He is a member of the writing team for Jetstream, a new adult course for Helping. Jeremy is a course designer and tutor on the MA TESOL at the New School, New York, and an occasional tutor at the Norwich Institute of Language Education. Away from ELT, Jeremy enjoys life as a practicing musician, songwriter, and spoken word performer. In this first session, Jeremy is going to talk about the topic, I don't teach answers, and we are going to explore whether we need to be facilitators, providers, or just teacher transmissions. Please join me to welcome Jeremy to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. And now, first task, switch on the microphone. That's a good idea, isn't it? Come on. There we are. How about that? And I'm right, aren't I, Ada? This is being live streamed. So I should say hello and welcome to anyone who's watching this live stream. It's lovely to have you with us in this crowded room. And perhaps you're more comfortable, but anyway, it's nice to have you with us. I don't know. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was lovely to meet you all yesterday, the majority of you. Today I want to, if you like, extend a little part of yesterday's talk. Because one of the issues we talked about yesterday in terms of whether change is going to happen is the whole issue of pedagogy and the curriculum. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to start by telling you about a movie, a film that you may have seen or you may not have seen. It's this one. Have you seen this movie? Hands up if you've seen it. Did you enjoy it? It's a lovely movie. If you get a chance, see it. I guarantee that you will leave the cinema correct with a smile. If you don't know anything about it, let me tell you. It's the extraordinary story of women of color who worked for the for NASA, the American Space Agency, back in the 1960s and the 1970s. And they were what were called computers. Why? Because they used their brain to do the mathematical calculations that the scientists needed in order to get the rockets and the men into space. You will remember your history that the space race at the beginning became this extraordinary competition between the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union, to see who was going to get people into space and on the moon first. And so NASA was a powerful part of that race. And these women were absolutely crucial in getting these rockets into space. But the fascinating thing about them is I never knew, nor did almost any American know, that within NASA there were women working. Because if you look at movies of that time, if you look at TV newsreel of that time, all the people in the control room were men, and all the people in the spacecraft were men. And the other thing I had absolutely, and the other thing is they were all white. So I had absolutely no idea, like most people, that these women had worked there. And that's why the title of the movie is really clever. It's called Hidden Figures, because they were hidden figures. But it's a clever title too, because what they were doing was mathematics. So that's another kind of figures. So it's kind of a cool title. Now, the three actresses you see in that poster are portraying three different people. On the left, as we look at it, is a woman who became the first ever engineer, female engineer at NASA. And she had to fight. They didn't want her to study to be an engineer. And she said, well, damn right I'm going to be an engineer. The woman on the right became the first female supervisor, team supervisor at NASA. And just like the other three women, she had to fight. And the woman in the middle, who is more or less the central figure of the movie, is a woman called Katherine Johnson. And Katherine Johnson, as a child, was a maths genius. She's just really, really good at maths. And it turns out that she was absolutely crucial in the calculation of how to get a man or a woman back to Earth. Because I'm sure you know that you have to come back in the right angle, because if you don't, you burn to a crisp. You burn, and then that's it, you're dead. And she calculated mathematically how to do it, just by maths. Her name was Katherine Johnson. Katherine Johnson is now 98 or 99 years old. The real Katherine Johnson. That's an actress. This is what she looks like. And there is Barack Obama giving her a Congressional Medal of Honor. Come back, Barack Obama. I didn't necessarily agree with all of his policies, but the man had grace and a wonderful family. Oh, anyway, enough. Stop. Okay. So there she is. Now, I don't know about you, and we'll come back to this later on in the talk. I don't know about you, but we live in 2017, as I said yesterday. And the really beautiful thing about living in 2017 is when you find out about somebody or something that interests you, what can you do? You can Google it. You can Google it. So after I saw this movie, I don't know about you, but after I saw this movie, I was really interested in this woman. She sounded incredible. So I Googled her and found out lots more about her. And this is the photograph is the result of that. I'd never heard of her in my life before the movie. So I wanted to know more about her. And in the course of my Googling, isn't it? It's a verb we all know, isn't it? To Google. In the course of all my Googling, I came across a TV interview with her. You can find it on YouTube. And in the middle of the interview, isn't it wonderful how your professional life and your other life of interest sometimes intersect? In the middle of the interviewer said, "And you've been a teacher, haven't you?" And all of her life, she's taught maths as well. And the interviewer said to her, how do you feel about the kind of modern world of education, test-driven education? And this was her reply.
I teach you what the model is, how to attack it. If you attack it properly, you will get the answer.
Which is, in some respects, we can have this conversation about standards of learning tests and the sort of teaching to the test and the big concern that teachers have about them.
Well, the attitude of my daughter is,
Can you hear it?
said that they taught only to the test.
They taught to the test.
So there's a lot of material out there that's not being taught.
I'll explain in a minute. Just
Well, that's so bad to the students, it's so bad to the teachers, that they are being taught that way. So I think it's important that you learn that.
okay. Look, enough. It sounds fine on the computer. Something's happened in the hookup, and we didn't get a chance to try it out. Luckily, I've got it all written down. So this is what she said. She said, my daughter has just retired from being a teacher, and she said the problem with teaching is they taught always to the test, and teachers only teach what is in the test. But that's unfair. It's unfair on the students, and it's really unfair on the teachers. And then she said, me personally, I have never taught answers. Let's investigate a little more of what she said. This is what she said about tests. And I don't know how you feel about this. Does this sound right to you? Yes. How much do tests rule your life? A lot, a little, or medium? A lot. In common with all over the world. And I have very mixed feelings about tests. Do you like tests? On the other hand, you've all survived tests, haven't you? Because you all did tests when you were kids.
No, when we were kids, we didn't have any tests.
You didn't have tests when you were kids?
No.
It's different what?
It depends on taste, on the character of the text.
You can't hear, but what she said is it depends on the character of the text. And that's absolutely correct. If I look back at the tests that people took for English public tests when I began teaching, and I compare them with modern tests, it is true to say that modern tests are significantly more sophisticated, realistic, whatever you want. Communicative, yes. And
Student-friendly.
And student-friendly. I completely agree with that. So it's not like tests haven't developed over the years, haven't got better. But in countries all over the world, we are also familiar with education systems that ask students to take tests which do not reflect the teaching that the teachers are encouraged to follow. So you frequently get a situation where people are saying you must teach more communicatively, you must do this more like this, more group work, more pair work, more talking, more learning through doing, and then the test ends up being a multiple choice test. And then the teacher says, well, how can I do that if that's the test? Now, we could have a long discussion about the purpose and role of tests in education generally. about whether it is necessary at certain stages to be able to say whether someone can do something and how well they can do it. But I think it's perfectly legitimate to express the concern that Catherine Johnson is expressing there, that the danger of tests is that if you focus too closely on the tests students are going to take, you may miss all the learning opportunities that are right there in front of you. And more importantly, you may restrict, if you like, the ways in which students could learn, possibly. Now, the end of that phrase, it says, I think it's important that you learn the background of what you're working on and how you do it. The background, the context, how it all works. Let's remember that Catherine Johnson's talking about mathematics. Is mathematics different from language? Well, of course it is, but you know what I mean. Pedagogically, that's a discussion for another time. But she also, oh, by the way, what do tests measure? Well, here's a trend. Tests measure things, because the whole point of a test is to say how many things you know, how many tokens you know. And this has always been the case. You can't see this, but this is a list of something I was talking about yesterday. This is a list of grammar from a course book from those days, back then. So it says here, for example, Unit 11, what have you got? Have got, singular, plural nouns, singular and plural who. Topics, possessions, 12, families, have got, singular, plural, possessive, S. 13, instructions, base form of the verbs, imperatives. 14, where do you live? Present simple, first, second, third persons. You recognize that. Typical grammar syllabus. And what does a test do? It measures how much of the grammar syllabus you know. And we've always wanted to have lists of things so we know what to do, apparently. But then along came this. Does this look familiar to you? Yes. It is the CFR, the Common European Framework of Reference. Yes. And they tried to do something genuinely radical. And the radical thing they were trying to do is to say, instead of having lists of things, why don't we try and describe lists of what people can do with language? So it says if you are C1 level in listening, you can contribute effectively to meetings and seminars within your own area of work, or keep up a casual conversation with a good degree of fluency, coping with abstract expressions. That's profoundly different from saying have got. And the really radical thing of what the CFR tried to suggest is that for the first time ever, an ordinary person themselves could say how good they were. Because if you read these descriptions, and if they're written in Armenian, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be, then you can say, how good is my English? And you check it and you say, so how good am I at speaking English? And you don't have to ask the teacher or take a test. You can just say, can I do these things? My second language is Spanish. And this is quite interesting for me in Spanish. I'm C1 going up to C2 sometimes, or if it's the wrong situation, I plunge to B2. You go up and down. But it's interesting that I don't need to, I've never taken a Spanish test. But I kind of know how good my Spanish is because of that. You know, and so, but of course what happened with the CFR is people then immediately started to colonize it and use it as another list. So then they started, people had to, trying to match lists up to exact things. Trying to match the can-do statements of the CFR up to precise lists, and so on and so forth. And if you think of a publisher like Pearson, they've spent years working on something called the Global Scale of English. And they've taken the Common European Framework, which was supposed to describe how good your English is, or your Russian, or your Georgian, or your Farsi, or your Spanish, or your Italian, or whatever it is. It's supposed to describe that in generic terms, and they've transformed it into a 99-point list of things, back to where we were in the first place, but more precise. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why that might be a good thing. The danger, of course, is that what it's doing is describing language as an accumulation of items, of little bits and pieces, as opposed to something rather more organic and flowing. However, let me just say about Pearson that the treasure hunt is great fun, I think, that Ade has suggested, and Pearson very kindly contributed the copies of my book, The Practice of English Language Teaching, for the treasure hunt, so I should thank them for that. So there we are. So that's one aspect of what she was talking about. It seems to me that most teachers are in the middle between feeling a great sense of resentment about the tyranny that tests exert and acceptance that they're part of the life we live. But Katherine Johnson has no doubt, and certainly in the US, which is what she's talking about, with the whole Common Core framework and the over-testing that goes on, her concern is plain for us to see. That's Cambridge English. They've got their own list as well. Everyone wants to have a better list of things. But here's the other thing she said. I've never taught answers. And that really interests me as a concept. Because, you know, what is your job? What is your job? And what does this famous word to teach mean? Because there are all sorts of ways of running a classroom. It may be the university classroom with the rooms around the walls and the chairs around the walls, and you can change them with lots of discussion, lots of interaction, lots of intellectual exchange. Or it may be the lecture where I tell you stuff and you go away grateful for this knowledge that you have learnt. Hopefully. But Katherine Johnson doesn't like that as a concept. She says the whole point of education is for the teacher to say, here's a problem, work it out. Work it out. See where you get to. And by the way, she says in that interview, if you fail first time or second time, that's fine. But the working out is the process of education. Whereas the teaching, the transferring of knowledge from this great brain to your still growing brains is not the way to do it. She's not the first person to say this. Have you ever come across this book before? Anybody recognize the title? Okay, Illich was an Austrian Catholic priest, a radical educationist, and in a strong tradition of radical educational thought. He assembled a bunch of people in a place called Cuernavaca in Mexico in 1969, and they had this powerful seminar to try and change the world of education forever. And the result was this book. You can probably gather the main philosophical thrust of the book by the title, De-Schooling Society. And the central quote, I think, from the book for me is this one. Is this one. Most learning is not the result of instruction. That's a pretty powerful thing. It's rather the result of unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. That the things we learn by doing for each other, with each other, and through experience are the powerful learning that we do. And the things we are taught don't even come close. That's the philosophy, that's the theory. That's the belief. In my, another part of my brain is saying, Jeremy, but you got 36 students, 1 hour and a half a week. Well, we'll leave that for a minute, if you don't mind. Have you come across this man? His name is Sugata Mitra. Ring a bell?
No.
Okay. Hole in the wall. Ring a bell? Okay, let me tell you about Sugata Mitra. And in order to contextualize that, we have in the UK a conference once a year called the IATEFL Conference. That stands for the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. And every year we attract 2,000, 2,500 people from around the world. From Armenia, from Iran, from Russia, from Spain, from Mexico, from Argentina, from Latvia, from Turkey, from everywhere. And they come to this 5-day conference, a 4-day conference. And it's a big thing. And you have workshops, and then each day you have a plenary. And in 2014, maybe 15, I can't remember, the closing plenary was given by this man, Sugata Mitra. And when it was over, half the audience rose to their feet with tears pouring down their faces and gave him a standing ovation. And the other half of the audience sat on their hands with smoke pouring out of their ears in fury. I've never seen anything like it. It's the most extraordinary experience I've ever come across. I have to say I was slightly on the sitting on my hands in fury brigade. What happened? Well, Sugata Mitra is famous in the world because when he was living in New Delhi, he ran an experiment. They put a computer in the wall. Some of you will have heard about this. And the computer was at the height of children, not adults, so no adults were interested. Back, my back. But the kids started playing with this strange thing that appeared in the wall. This was 1997. They started playing with this strange thing in the wall, even though it was not in their language. And they weren't rich kids, they were kids from a poor area. And they started playing with the computer there, and you know what happened? Within almost no time at all, groups of kids, they were starting to use this and manipulate this computer and play with the computer and work it out all on their own. And pretty soon, they were actually downloading antivirus software and stuff like that. Amazing. And there wasn't a single teacher saying, the first thing you must do is press the red button. They just did it themselves. Remember, most learning is not the result of instruction. It is the result of unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. He was carrying out Ilyich's radical thought. And this led him on to suggest that actually education would work much better if we spent our time asking children questions and then giving them the means to find the answers for themselves.
To work themselves.
To work it out for themselves, exactly. And he said, his point, he worked for IBM Computers at the time. That's a slightly worrying part. But his claim at the time his claim at the time was, we now live in an age where you can find out anything you want. Google it. Find it out. And all you have to do is to ask kids a big question, and they will come up with the answers. You could ask kids, for example, do we have souls? I can spend a lot of my time, maybe in religious instruction or something, explaining the concept of a soul. But how about if I just say, what do you think? Do you think you've got a soul? Well, find out. Now, in Sugata Mitra's world, by the way, this does not involve you getting your cell phone out, because that's an individual activity. He says that it involves groups of 4 or 5 kids round one computer screen, terminal, or one device, because the group participation in this inquiry is what really matters. That's his idea. And so he comes up with the idea of souls, but this time without the U. And souls stands for self-organized learning environment. Self-organized learning environment, SOLE. And he says that's how learning really takes place. And he's channeling Ivan Illich from 35, 40 years before. And maybe right back to the Greeks and the whole Aristotelian Socratic dialogue and everything else like that. And he says, so what we need to work at is minimally invasive education. And of course the reason why people got so mad at him is he said, and we don't need teachers anymore. You don't need teachers. All you need are empathetic adults. Well, empathetic guides. Because all they have to do is ask the questions and then gently say to the students, how did you find your answer? That's all you need to do. And he came up with a rather unfortunate idea of what he calls grannies in the cloud. But we'll talk about that some other time. But the good thing and the bad thing. The good thing, what he was trying to ask technology to do is to resolve a situation of profound inequality in India and in many other countries of the world, which is that if you live in New Delhi and Mumbai, you'll probably have a good school and a good teacher and a committed teacher and a teacher who's happy doing what they want. But the further you move out into the countryside, the less possibility there is of having a teacher who is satisfied with what they're doing. This is him talking, not me. Satisfied with what they're doing. And by the time you get right out into the middle of nowhere, you may have no teacher at all in rural parts of India. And the dream then is this kind of thing with a computer and broadband and a remote teacher from afar will change that forever. And if you like, create we have this expression in British English, create a level playing field where everyone is on the same level. But the reason that he made people so mad is he came to a conference of highly trained professionals who spent their whole lives trying to improve and get better at what they do and told them they were not worth anything. And that's not a terribly good PR move, to be honest. He might, and then there's a school that if you were here yesterday, I told you about, which also is a Catherine Johnson school, even though it's probably never heard of Catherine Johnson, and she's never heard of them. And it's an Illich school and a Sugata Mitra school, if you like, because what they say, do you remember the story of the kid? What they say is, they say to kids, here's a project, do it. And when you've done it, we'll discuss what you learned. Wow. Fantastic. It's probably in a nice part of Berlin. A school, could you adopt this system through an entire education system? Woo, well, that's asking quite a lot. But if you remember, the head teacher says this. And let's contrast that with another event at the IATEFL conference. Remember, that's the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. And this was a debate, and it featured, in particular, two people. One was a woman who represented a chain of language schools in China called the New Oriental Schools. And the other was a man who some of you are very familiar with called Jim Scrivener, who's certainly been here for one of these events. Now, to very briefly contextualize this, this is all part of a huge introduction, by the way. We're going to get to some practical working of what I'm talking about. The context was this. New Oriental Schools invited Jim Scrivener to go to China. And they invited him to visit a lot of their classes, observe them, and then make suggestions about what they could do to improve or develop. Improve, that's too evaluative. To develop. That was the idea. It seemed to be a marriage made in hell, from what I understand from the event I witnessed. You know that expression, a marriage made in heaven. Well, this was obviously the opposite. Because what Jim saw did not please Jim. And you might very well have felt the same as him. This is what he says he observed. The teacher's position was typically standing at the front. No university chairs round the walls for him, for these teachers. There were limited efforts to build any relationship or rapport. And yet if you read my books, if you read Jim's books, if you read Pennier's books and all these other sort of people, we spend a lot of time talking about the relationship that the teacher creates between themselves and the students. There was exaggerated personality by lecturing in a distinctive way. In other words, the teacher was the star. The star. A microphone. I'm getting very neurotic about this, actually. It's beginning to sound rather familiar. And the act of teaching was a performance. And what Jim wanted to suggest is that Jim wanted to be much more Katherine Johnson than this. And he said, hey, come on, guys, but surely teaching answers isn't the way. Learning is what the students do, and that's what teachers need to encourage. And the Chinese representative, by the way, many Chinese people watched this session made the point that what Jim was describing did not describe some of the more recent developments in Chinese teaching, especially the Chinese teaching of English. They said this was a caricature of what happens in China. I've been to China on a number of occasions. The only class I've ever seen, I've only observed in China, was absolutely fabulous. But that's one class, and Jim observed many. So maybe it's something to do with the actual chain of schools, the New Oriental schools, who knows? But what the Chinese person said in defense against Jim's critique was, you know, rapport. In China, rapport comes from the teacher. If the teacher seems to know what they're doing, rapport is created. That's what rapport is all about. Not about me respecting your answers and looking deeply into your eyes and being friendly and cheerful and lovely. And she quoted this phrase in Chinese, something like "Yiri wei shi, zhongshen wei fu." I don't know if I got my tones right, but teacher for one day, father forever. Which on so many levels is an interesting saying. both gender-wise and pedagogic-wise. But she said, we have a different idea of what the teacher is. So what I offer you here, the whole of this preamble has been to say, I think the world of education for at least 2,000 years has been permanently divided between a view of teaching, which is sort of what's happening at this particular minute, and a view of teaching which says the job of the teacher is to provoke students into unhampered participation in a meaningful setting, to use Illich's words, because that's how learning happens. And the danger is, according to Catherine Johnson, and that's how we started, that the danger is that by an over focus on testing, we are, if you like, encouraging the former and not the latter. Or, to put it more succinctly, this, can anyone recognize that flag? That's the Mexican flag. It's the Mexican flag, and it's not a very good photo I took on October the 24th, flying above the cathedral in my favorite city in the world. Oh no, sorry, Yerevan's my favorite city in the world. In my favorite city in the world, which is a city called Oaxaca, spelled O-A-X-A-C-A, Oaxaca in Mexico. And I won't go into reasons why I love it so much or why I love Mexico so much, but there you are. So I was there happily, for once on holiday. And the center of the main square where this cathedral is located was full of tents. And the tents were all occupied by teachers from the state of Oaxaca. Oaxaca is the capital city of the state of Oaxaca. And the teachers have been having a massive row with the state government about education funding, education provision, and so on and so forth. And this is all tied in with much of the political uncertainty and unrest in Mexico, and so on. So all over the square, it's one of the most beautiful squares in Mexico, but it's just full of tents. You know, and so you have this rather bizarre thing of all these restaurants with tourists and stuff like that, and they're in the middle of the square. A big square, massive amount of tents. And the only reason I'm telling you this is that they have sort of plastic sheeting, and attached to the plastic sheeting, and I was thinking about this talk and about coming to Armenia, attached to the plastic sheeting was a poster someone had made, and I took a photograph of it. This was it. El propósito de la educación es mostrar a la gente cómo aprender por sí misma. El otro concepto de la educación es adoctrinamiento. Anybody speak Spanish? Yeah? So you understand that. What it means, if you like, is the whole purpose of education. The whole purpose of education is to show people how to learn for themselves. The other idea of education is indoctrination. So that's kind of Illich, but now with kind of revolutionary fervor, if you like. So the whole point of education is to show people how to learn for themselves. And the opposite? Indoctrination. And that, if you like, is the whole argument about education, the philosophical argument about education we've been having for 2,000 years, and maybe longer. And this argument happens as much in Armenia as it does to the north, the south, the west, and the east, it seems to me. So Catherine Johnson is on the first side, to show people how to learn for themselves. But apparently, based purely on Jim's testimony, so I can't say how accurate this is, apparently some of the classes he observed on the other side are exactly the other side of the argument. Indoctrination. Here's a demonstration of what we're talking about. That's a picture of my sitting room, part of my sitting room. You'll see a bit of a theme there. Those are some of my guitars. Well, yes. I mean, it's like having children. It's like having a family, you know. And I must say that the one facing us in the middle, I've got with me here in Yerevan, and that's because if you're not doing anything at 5 o'clock, I'm doing a show in what's it called, the Meria 53 Hotel, called Shakespeare and Other Folk. And it's about, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare, our great national writer, and sing some songs of settings of his music and sing some other songs. And it'd be lovely if you came along. But that's neither here nor there. Now, the question is, put your hands up if you play the guitar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the real question is, how did you learn? Or put your hands up if you play another musical instrument. So quite a few of us play musical instruments. And the question is, how did you learn? I guess in the old days, pre-Google, the best way to learn was to get yourselves a teacher and practice and things like that. But of course now you don't need that anymore, do you? You don't need that anymore. You can just Google. So I'm going to give you a guitar lesson. Well, I'm not going to give you a guitar lesson. For example, I don't want to be technical, but just to quickly explain what you're going to see, and the sound will be terrible, but you'll get the idea. I want to explain how to play in Dadgad. And Dadgad is the name we give when you tune the strings of the guitar to a different tuning. So instead of having E, A, you tune them to D, A, D, G, A, D. Dadgad. So how do you play in Dadgad? Because you're going to have to put your fingers in all sorts of different places on the neck, on the fingerboard. Well, maybe I can go to you and you'll teach me. But you know what? You live in the difficult part of town. It's going to take me too long to get there, and I'm nervous. So I'll just go to YouTube. It's easy. I'll just go to YouTube and watch something, and that'll teach me how to do it. See? So here we are. Oh, I turned the sound off, didn't I? But you get... Easy. Easy, right? Easy. Well, you can see it, you can watch it 3,000 times. All you have to do is put your fingers exactly where he put them and you'll make that sound. Easy. How many people in this room would actually do that? It's a bit like, do you remember yesterday we were talking about these online learning a language things on your phone? How many of you learn a language that way? Well, you all can, but not many of us do. Why do I mention this? Well, because one of my favorite books that I've read recently is this book. And I love this book for two reasons. One is because, as you might have guessed from my photograph, I'm a little obsessed with guitars. I love guitars and playing the guitar and music and all sorts of music. But the other is because Gary Marcus, the writer, is a cognitive psychologist. A cognitive psychologist. So at the age of 39, he decided to learn the guitar from zero, from nothing. He'd never touched a guitar in his life before. That's why it's called Guitar Zero. So he decided to learn the guitar. And the book is all about his experiences of learning the guitar, informed by his knowledge about cognitive psychology. So he brings his academic discipline to describe his personal experience of learning the guitar. And I recommend it highly as a book. It's interesting and has insights about the brain and how the brain works, and about what you need. And one of the things that Gary, he gave himself lots of different experiences. He went to talk to a lot of different musicians, both rock musicians and classical musicians, to ask them. And there's one particular paragraph of the book when I read it that absolutely fascinated me. Because, do you remember what I said about Katherine Johnson? When your professional life and your kind of life of interest intersect. And it was this paragraph here, which you're not going to read. So would you summarize it for you? The question is, why do we need teachers at all? And this is Gary Marcus's answer to Sugata Mitra. Do you remember the hole in the wall guy?
Yes.
Although, as far as I know, they've never met or discussed. But if you like, this would be his answer. The first reason we need teachers is because teachers know things. What do you know? What do I know? Well, I guess I know, I hope I know a little bit about life. Made a bit of a mess of it so far, but, you know, on the whole. But I guess I know quite a lot about English. Do you? Yes, of course you do. So we all know quite a lot about English. I know quite a lot about ways of teaching. Do you?
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
So we know quite a lot about ways of teaching. I've got quite a lot of experience of typical student responses.
Yes.
Do you?
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
And in other, we could go on like this. We know quite a lot. And every time you walk into class, you take that knowledge with you. And some of it comes from study, and a lot of it comes from experience, and so on. He says teachers can motivate
Yes.
students.
Absolutely.
And if you can't motivate students, you're in the wrong job. But yes, we can. You can walk into a class where the students are sitting there with their shoulders down and their eyes dull. And not always, because sometimes it's almost impossible, but not always, but sometimes a good teacher, a competent teacher, can get their shoulders up and get their eyes shining. That's what we do. It's in our DNA. It's part of who we are. He says, teachers can provide incentive. Now, when Gary Marcus was talking about learning the guitar, in his case, the incentive was very powerful. And certainly when I play the viola as well, and I had to learn the viola, and I took classes. And the teacher says to you, come next week and learn this piece and play this piece. That's an incentive. Because I can promise you, and anyone here who has taken music lessons knows this, I can promise you that standing there in front of your teacher playing a piece badly is not a comfortable feeling. So when they say, come next week and bring this piece and play it to me, that's incentive. Because the one thing you don't want is to go like that. And teachers can do that. Teachers can provide signposts and incentives and things to aim for. Of course, the end of that is tests, but that's a whole other story. He says, teachers can pinpoint errors and target weaknesses. There's a man I know in the UK who teaches the cello. And he's well known as a teacher, and everyone says he's a wonderful teacher. And I asked one of his best friends, why does everyone say that he's such a good teacher? And my friend said to me, well, he's got this reputation of knowing almost instantly why things are going wrong. He kind of has this ability to spot the problem. A good cello player comes and plays something, and this guy has this ability to kind of say, no, well, the reason this is, no. He can pinpoint the error. He can spot the weakness. A great talent. And a good teacher, supposedly, one of the things that they can do is help you to understand what the problem is and why things are going wrong. And this is the one that interests me too. A good teacher can impose structure. That's a slightly, makes me slightly nervous too because of the word impose. A good teacher can impose structure. I'm not so sure. But I like the basic concept. Those of you who do not play the guitar, I could give you a guitar. I'm not going to because I don't have enough money, but I could give you a guitar and say, go on, learn it. But my suspicion is that some of you would look at this thing and just go, what do I do now? It's got too many strings, and yes, you've seen lots of films, you know how to hold it, do you? But what do you actually do? But what a good teacher can do is help you to do something first, and something second, and something third and fourth, until you get to the stage where suddenly you're flying. You know. So, there we are. So it seems to me that we've arrived at a kind of simplistic, I apologize for that, dichotomy, division, opposition between teachers who think that teaching is about answering things. That's, if you like, the caricature of those Chinese teachers. And teachers who think their job is to explain to you what the problem is and then let you get on with it yourselves. And if you were to say that these things existed on a scale of 1 to 10, just silently, without talking to anybody, what number would you choose for yourself? Silently, without, just have a think. What number would you choose for yourself? And have a think why. Silently. And now tell the person next to you what number you've chosen and find out what number they've chosen and see if you agree. Off you go. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Would anyone like to tell us what you were saying? Anyone like to give the opinions they were giving? Anybody? Come on, we're all teachers. We can do this. Teacher voice, anybody? Yes, please.
Okay, so for my own self, I've chosen number 10.
Yeah.
Which is closer to what the problem is. Oh, yeah, okay. So which is closer to the problem is. Why? Because I like the statement that was made by Katherine Johnson. Because when you attack the problem, when you leave your students, or they can be school children or whoever, it can be ourselves as well. And so when you leave them with attacking and tackling the problem themselves, they're going to come up with great answers, I'm sure. Because from my own experience, when something interests me, for example, I watched the movie Anonymous, which talks about Shakespeare being real or not, Edward, and so on. You start going to Google and Googling about Edward and who he is, and, you know, is it possible that Shakespeare didn't exist or so? So basically you come up with your own answer. No, in this case, nobody has taught me things or taught me the answers who Edward is, Shakespeare is it true or not? Is it a false statement or not? So you go and you figure out it yourself. She said it right, that you present the problem and you leave the kids or the students to attack the problem themselves. And I'm sure they can come up with great answers, the ones that even are surprising for your own self. So which is number 10, what the problem is.
Thank you very much. Can I just, yes, that's wonderful. I just say, I come from Stratford-on-Avon. It was Shakespeare. No, by the way, that's a really interesting controversy. It's been going on forever. Did Shakespeare write Shakespeare? Seriously, my belief is yes, he did. But the argument's going to go on.
Yeah.
It's a bit like anybody else? Anybody else? I've got a really nice. Yes, please. Hold on. Excuse me. Sorry, you're sitting in Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that we can have number 4. This is what I feel like. So teaching us things, and 8 for what the problem is. But I do not think that we have something absolute to give number 10. So we should always try to get something in between, or to have a balanced proportion, a good proportion for the specific class, for the specific goal we have for this class. So a lot of factors do matter, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That if I understand you correctly, it's not. No, please. It's not an absolute. You can't just say I'm this or I'm that.
Yeah. Yes.
It depends on.
It depends on different factors, different circumstances. What kind of class you have? What is your goal? How long time is, and so on.
Did you hear that? It depends. I'm sorry. I took the microphone away from her. I'm sorry. Just say what you just said again.
Actually, these circumstances may vary, like from the class, the age, the goal, the time you have at your disposal, all these things, the settings, the culture, all these things really matter. And also what you teach, its language, or whatever. Well, actually, on the whole, the philosophy of teaching is the same. It doesn't matter what you teach, but there are some specificities in each discipline. So we cannot circumvent this too. So this is also a matter to think over. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. From Iran, yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
After watching Katherine Johnson and seeing things and remembering how we learned and how we are teaching, my very good friend mentioned that at the end you gotta teach the syllabus and cover it, and the students need to cover some things in order to pass the exam, entrance exam, whatever that is. So everybody wants to be a number 10, but they're mostly working with 1 and 2, and we are hoping that the students get the answer themselves and come up with the answer, because I think it's a very good feeling when you see that your students came up with the answer that you just taught the way how to do it. So for being a good 9, 10, or 8, I think we need to have some changes in the educational system. So the system is not based on the exams and everything.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Which is, of course, the whole dilemma that Catherine Johnson mentioned in that interview. I think I'm getting a sort of, we got a strong statement over there about I thought the Shakespeare story was absolutely correct. I'll come back in a second. It reminds me of something I was talking about this morning. We did an interview in a TV channel this morning, and we were talking about, and one of the questions was the typical question about, you know, so what's the best way? What should we do to teach? And ouch. But I found myself telling a story which I tell frequently, and it's a question I'd love to know your story in the same way. And the question is, I frequently ask teachers around the world who speak English as a second, third, or fourth language, how come you speak such good English? Do the people you went to school with speak as good English as you do? Do they speak as well as you do? And most people say, no, they don't. I was different from the others. Why? And that's the really interesting question for me. And you get lots of answers. Sometimes, I'm pleased to say, they say, well, it was because of a teacher. This teacher really, yes, thank you. Probably just hold it or turn it off. Yes. Sometimes it's because of a good teacher, a teacher who just, if you like, turned them on in the right way. And that's very empowering for us to hear. But sometimes it's which is really interesting, it's because something drove the students to want to get English. There was a guy who works at the Universidad Agronómica de La Habana in Cuba, the agronomy university in Havana in Cuba. And he said when he was 11, he got obsessed with a computer game. I've always been, I never asked him how, because Cuba has a scarcity of resources, but that's another story. And he was so obsessed with this game that he taught himself English so he could play it. I met a woman at the Greek Hellenic Institute in Athens, and she said when she was a teenager she was obsessed with fashion. She said the only really good fashion magazines she could find were in English. So what did she do? She taught herself English so she could learn it. That was her passion. Various other people say that it was their passion for something that took them to English and drove them to English. And it reminds me of my brother. I have a lovely brother. He's 11 years younger than me. He's much better looking. He's much nicer. He's altogether a wonderful guy. And he's also a really good teacher. And his speciality is teaching advanced classes, C1 level, C1, C2 level. That's what he does especially well, and has a fine reputation for doing it, and his students generally seem to love him a lot. But for reasons, health reasons, which I won't bore you with, he's not teaching at the moment. And so he and his partner went off to Spain for 3 months in a camper van, you know, and they went to Spain, and I rang him up in Spain, and I said, "Hello, Philip, how are you getting on?" And he said, "Well, oh, it's great, we're having a fantastic time." And I said, "How's your Spanish?" You know, because he didn't speak Spanish before. He said, "Oh, it's coming on, you know." I said, "Oh, that's great." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I've discovered this thing." He said that, like, when you really need something, you know, you learn how to say it, and then you say it, and then you've learnt it. For example, you know, he said, you know, they have really nice red wine here, but they have a special way of saying, you know, a glass of red wine. So I learned how to say quiero un clarete or something like that, and then they give it to me, and now I've learnt it. And he was really impressed with this great insight he'd had This is an experienced teacher who's been teaching for years, who knows about teaching, and he's suddenly discovered what he's always known, which is, if the students have a need, guess what? They'll satisfy the need. The computer game, the fashion magazine, the glass of wine, or whatever it is.
To be in the environment. To be in the environment.
And of course, in Philip's case, but not in the case of the Greek woman or the Cuban. In Philip's case, of course, he's right there in the middle of a Spanish-speaking environment, and that's pretty useful. If I want to learn Armenian, I'm pretty certain that I'm much better coming here than trying to learn it there.
Yes.
But then if we could all do that, you'd send all your students to a little village in England for 2 years. But that's not very practical as a concept. Did we get off the point a little bit there? Sort of. I mean, the whole point about your Shakespeare story is exactly what I've just articulated, which is, you know, you just suddenly, for some reason, have this urge to find something out, like the Cuban and the thing. So you know, one simplistic answer to a TV interview question, which is things like, what's the best way to teach English, is well, find the trigger, find the spot for each individual student, find the thing that they need, and if you can find that and switch it on, woof, magic. And that's what Sugata Mitra would say. They needed to learn how to use the computer, so they did. Or
Gardner MIT theory. Multiple intelligence theory, Howard Gardner's.
Well, the MI theory, the multiple intelligence theory, suggested that the different people have different sort of intelligence, ways of absorbing different responses to different things. We could discuss that later. But it's to do with the same kind of thing. But we all live in education systems. And they need to be able to measure what students know so that they can work out whether it's working or not. And then you have the problem that our Iranian colleague was discussing before. Anything else? Does anybody want to say anything else? Yes. Let's. I need to switch this on again. Oh, good.
Just wanted to say that we also got something in the middle. So I said 6 because I want to go to what's the problem. I want to give them the problem, let them to find, discover it. But let's face the reality, we cannot just stop teaching answers because students anticipate it. They come to the class expecting to get answers from us. So for starting point, we cannot just stop giving answers and just giving problems.
Because if I understand, thank you very much, by the way. That was a good contribution. Thank you. It might be worth saying, mightn't it, that the Greek woman and the Cuban man are not typical. It's not every student who suddenly wants to learn how to play a computer game or to read about fashion. It's not every student who can learn on their own. It's not every guitarist who can sit in their bedroom and learn by themselves how to play the guitar.
It depends on the motives and motivation the students and the person has.
She says it depends on the motivation and what each individual person has, the strength, the need. Please.
Self-discipline, yes, determination.
Oh, and by the way, this 11-year-old in Cuba must have demonstrated what she's just mentioned, which is discipline, determination, really quite an exceptional, dedication to what he wanted to do. But if I say that the teacher's greatest gift is to somehow find the need of students and activate it, you can't disagree with that. It's just that on an institutional scale, it's very difficult to do. And we'll talk about that in greater detail on Sunday, if you're here, when we talk about mixed ability. Because, of course, all all groups of students, even if they all come from the same street of the same village of the same province in Armenia, they're not all the same. They're never all the same. And that makes things difficult. What I was going to do, and to answer your point, most teachers, it seems to me, spend their lives trying to do what you're doing, which is to juggle these, which is, I think was your point as well, about syllabuses, curriculums, tests, trying to juggle the two ends of this scale. That's what we do. But the reason for having this kind of philosophical discussion, and this isn't the first time you've had this kind of discussion, I'm sure, and it won't be the last. We talk about this in my world, have conversations like this all the time. The reason for having these kind of discussions is to try and be permanently conscious of this duality within us. And to say that if we find that we're doing too much of the answer teaching, that's when we need to correct ourselves and allow the students to come through. That one of the things I'm a passionate believer in is the idea that teachers need at least two brains. One is not enough. And the first brain is what we do, and the second is the brain that kind of hovers in the air, watching what we're doing as we're doing it, like a kind of out-of-body phenomenon, and tries to evaluate how things are going. And it's that second brain that needs to be conscious of this kind of philosophical discussion all the time, trying to work out how far we've gone this way or that way. I was going to, but I'm not, because we need a break. I was going to take you through some activities and ask you where you thought these worked. And this is a terrible thing to do, to do this. It just shows bad timing on my part. And I was going to take you through some activities and ask you to say where you thought they fit on that scale, and which activities you liked. Because the real interesting thing about teaching is that if we ask ourselves what we like, and you then ask separately what we believe, you often find the two things don't match. And that's quite an interesting discussion to have. But we will have that discussion at another time. For the moment, it's worth saying, and this absolutely echoes, if you like, some of the things that you were saying, and this also has something to do with your context argument, is that a lot of this depends on where we are, where they are, what the situation is. The other thing is an enormous drive in some circles to try and measure the effectiveness, the efficacy of what we do. How can you tell that this works? Which is a good question, but it's a dangerous question. Because if you obsess about trying to say whether it works, you then have to narrow down what you're doing to show efficacy. But of course, some of the greatest learning takes place in the margins, in the spaces between what we're doing. We know that. Testing is, of course, as we've discussed, a huge barrier to Katherine Johnson. And so is the system. And in almost every country, the system says, this is what people have to do, and we want everyone to do this within the system. And the system needs, because after all, it's taxpayers' money that controls the system demands results from education, because we don't want to think that the money is wasted. And that is a problem. And the public school systems are like that. But of course, the old famous aphorism, who said it? people who know the price of everything but the value of nothing. And my brain has gotten completely dead about, it must be because I fell down, about who said that. But the idea that if you focus on efficacy and systems and testing, that's all about the price, but it's the value that matters, the values that education enshrines. I heard someone actually say we should do that the other way around. And say, actually, there's something also wrong with people who know the value of everything and the price of nothing. And that brings us right back to the beginning of this argument. As for, we've talked about this. We're not going to talk about that. But come back. There's Katherine Johnson at last year's Oscar ceremonies. And as you can see, the three women beside her are the actresses from the movie. And there she is. And the audience rose to their feet to applaud her. After the break, when are we starting again?
2:30.
2:30. Oh gosh, yes. So a rushed lunch. Sorry about that. And then we're going to change gear completely. And we're going to talk about stories. Thank you very much. See you.